like sometimes it's a blessing and a curse to know too much, you know, because like the average home buyer never would have thought to go through that process, but you were like super proactive about it.
Well, I hope if you deal with it every day, then you kind of know how to handle it when it,
Are you doing
shows
well
up
today?
Well, definitely when you get up in front of the man, he goes, "So you think you should have known?"
Yeah.
Yeah,
the ignorance argument never holds water.
never flies, does it?
So we're recording from that camera and that microphone in the ceiling.
Okay, cool.
I don't think anyone's going to be watching live, but there are a few who said they couldn't make it and wanted to
Neat.
go back later.
Sure. Well, that's helpful too. And then, I'll let
Still looking
Keith
down at the
and
ground.
Carl know afterwards. I was planning on PDFing
Which
it
is always a good
and I'll
thing.
send
That'd be
it
great.
that way. So then the group will have the slides afterwards.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no, our pleasure.
I got about an hour's worth after this, and then
What?
I got about an hour's worth after this, and then I'm headed home. I gotta head to James Madison's home tonight, doing a candlelight tour thing.
Do you want me to go ahead and invite this to come through?
I don't know how many seasons promised.
It's a bonus, yeah.
I purchased my first investment property about 5 months ago.
That way? Okay.
How come nobody's got anything to eat?
I don't know.
As you all know, there's lunch as a part of this presentation, so everything's pretty much ready. They're getting some water cups set up for you, but otherwise it's Jimmy John subs, some chips and cookies. So help yourself, and then another 10 minutes or so we'll probably get started.
No pushing or shoving.
I was doing all an investment property. And my first investment property out.
I walked into, so it was Jersey Mike's on Monday and Jimmy John's today, and the smell of the bread is so overwhelming. And I'm just like drinking it in since I can't actually eat. It was like so tempting.
Well, it was actually
Many years ago in Winchester, someplace called the Lunch, and the gentleman that had he had all this massive human building.
Oh, I can take it for you.
Gotcha,
Trying to
Well,
tell.
of course now.
that construction ended about 2 months ago.
And yeah, we went there for a long time. Of course, it was locally owned. He eventually went on. Probably.
Oh, you wanted my cookie, didn't you? Here.
There you go. Can I get you a drink of water?
Oh, no, I'm fine, thank you, though.
Yeah, I was.
But I wonder if there's
Yeah,
other
they
time
tried and they had tried to do this deal for about like 6 months at that time. And so I was like, well, I gotta be more active with the property. So I actually gave my
I like
what's the name of that, so we could get on it.
I like the coffee room at the Winchester office. He just sounds he needs some work done to that.
I got it for,
I mean,
appraisal came in at
you
175.
got the Winchester office with 15 people. Because Hager's office was 20.
Right.
Yeah,
But then when he and Nick talk about it, he's like, well, why don't we just blow through these walls and improve the life? It's like, no, it's not necessarily Phoenix. But I don't think that would stand. I just think that would be nice to try to see the furniture and stuff that would make it like look more flexible. The big
Can you share that?
Yes, absolutely.
out if you wanted to do something like this with the rows of seats or something. So I don't know. It's just
In that case, in that room, the conference table was sometimes
No.
to do
I don't know if I would know my husband doesn't want to stress on it.
Yeah.
He was a lender for 35 years.
did you get a chance to see my email about the Deerfield
No, I
Christmas
didn't.
party for the Manchester Show offices?
Yeah,
Oh, that's
great.
okay.
Okay. Then Charlottesville?
I was in Charleston.
My sister's in EDA.
Yeah?
Emergency asbestos
Okay.
inspections.
Yeah.
No ties to it.
So, Canaan and Lloyd, they're about to quarry very simply today.
Charlottesville.
So a little bit concerned with them being out on the waters and the wind.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Where's our other cottonwood cohorts?
So I feel a little guilty that I'm not out there because the plane being up there. Canaan took today.
Yes.
He's deer hunting.
Who's that?
Right.
Lives in Florida, right?
Tomorrow I
Right,
think it's supposed
right.
to be nicer, not quite as windy.
Across
Right.
the road, 1.9 acres. But it's
My
2
snow
acres and
boots and then I
42.
get it out of my
So,
car.
but has that sold yet? Still hasn't sold.
There's
The
got
wind
3
is
tracks
in,
between 2 and 4 acres.
I was working on the laptop.
Jamie's is 15,000
Diana
acres.
got our stuff out of the front porch. We've lived there long enough. to
Yeah.
know that
Yeah, well,
weather-
but those smaller pieces, that's for a home site. That's a home site
He looked
project.
out.
So that's the difference.
I've asked the realtor
She
to
left.
contact her
It's a long way.
be willing to consider it.
It's,
Yeah, that's good.
we have new neighbors.
Client buyer has called me back. They talked
Moved
about
in
it.
maybe 2 or 3 months ago. and Diana
Good.
Williams, very well, needs sure thing. It was last week or Wednesday night before
Are you
Thanksgiving.
familiar with Ridge Road, where it is in that
She
area?
texted Diana this morning.
I've been on there, but I
Blew all
don't
the
have any
front
brain.
porch, blew off 2 shutters.
We went through there on
So,
the first.
where we're at, spring.
Isn't Ridge Road like near,
Right.
And
is that the one that ties into Timberville, and goes from 42 that ties into Timberville?
So much but we were, Peterstown is a little bit
Oh,
more
oh, wow.
condensed, we're a little bit closer together, so we might get a tunnels, and not like we have the bridge at our current house.
Unless we got cash. It's always a bummer for presenters because we're eating and you guys are not eating. So that's like the ultimate. So you're not only working, but you're not eating.
no,
So
it works
that's-
out great because y'all don't ask questions. Because you're too
Oh
busy.
yeah, okay, yeah, we'll make sure we extend it a little bit more and ask questions, so. You guys are from Winchester and Henderson, that's where the office is?
This is where the office was. We also have one in Sterling. Smaller office in Sterling,
Now,
so.
you did have an office here, do you still have an office here?
We do not.
Okay.
The warehouse road on
Right,
State
yeah.
Barracks and then out on Acorn Drive next to Rodeman.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually work here.
Oh, you did? So do you live here or do you?
I live in Shenandoah County.
Okay, so you're close.
Yes, and I have still have a family farm over in Pendleton
Really?
County.
But, so your family is from here?
It's from Pendleton County, Sugar Grove area.
Okay. My mother's from Hardy County. So,
Morfield and Mortonville?
she was from Matthias, Los
Oh,
City.
five.
And then I live back in Berkton, so our land actually goes over into Hardy, but it's very close to where Hamilton joins. So it's a very set. Once everybody grabs a seat, then we'll
Okay.
jump up.
No, you're right, there's still some other fun too. Would you like a glass of water or anything?
I think this guy's the reason you guys are here.
I'm sorry.
So didn't you do the original?
He gets the praise or the blame.
I was gonna say, let's not say that yet.
Hey, Jimmy.
The season is so dry, I guess drinking relentlessly.
Well, this morning I didn't get my whole cup of coffee.
Okay. I'm new agent and.
That's surprising, I feel like I drink more coffee than I want because the pot's right there. And I just keep going. Sorry.
See, I had to wait for someone else to make it, so that's why I drink more.
At home, you can make yourself. I definitely have myself like 2.5 cups of had meeting in Hagerstown and then I went to the opposite before I left my meeting in Hagerstown, so I'm gonna get some coffee. They had a cake and stuff.
They have an open house in the camp.
Yeah, when was that? just a couple months, September.
But I know, well, Nick and Randy were up there like, in the board meeting. They were up there like the last 2 weeks, I thought. Harrisburg.
Oh, it was for I'm not sure what project. When I talked to Randy, he brought it up when I was here on Monday, because I was asking about, Mrs. Duffy, who was supposed to be paid, he said, well, that'll be fine, because he was trained.
Good to hear.
It was ridiculous, that was brought into it. So I don't know how it all panned out, but I'm sure it wasn't.
Well, Nick just did get him up 2 days.
They weren't sure if it was gonna go 2 days, but the fact that Randy was there, he was in the office this morning, makes me think they got it all taken care of yesterday. I just like passed the sign to them. My family used to vacation there when I was growing up. True. I haven't been there in a number of years. I've heard it's grown quite a bit.
I've looked him up. He keeps my teenagers to the front.
Just to me, we also have an officer.
Brian is adventurous, and he's like,
Right? I don't.
All right, everybody, maybe we can begin and to start the presentation. So we're happy to have Jeff Mitchell and Cindy Powell, I think, from Triad Engineering to give us sort of environmental due diligence. We run into this a lot on the commercial side, but I know you also run into it on the residential side. And we normally don't have this good of a turnout for a lunch and learn. So you guys, the pressure's on, but obviously there's an interest in the topic. So, but really do appreciate you all coming down. They came down from their offices even in Maryland and Winchester. So we really appreciate you all coming down and to present with us, and we're looking forward to it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And as we eat, we'll listen to you talk.
Sure. Well, I'm actually not going to be doing much speaking, but I am Cindy Powell, I'm the Business Development Leader for our Eastern region. Jeff Mitchell, he's our senior geologist and really the expert on the subject. So he's going to take you through some of the basics, the different types of environmental assessments, but really I think what you'll gain most from the presentation is the real life examples. We'll really start to dig into that and have more of a conversation. Feel free to ask a question at any point throughout the presentation. It's very informal, so we welcome that kind of engagement. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to Jeff and let him get started. Yeah.
I have some business cards. I'm going to place a couple of them back here on this table so that y'all can have those. They reach out. So I'm Jeff Mitchell. I'm a geologist. I'm an environmental geologist. Didn't start out that way, but with environmental regulations that have come about over the years, that's kind of the niche that I've moved into. I started in 1988, started working in Harrisonburg, and actually some of the projects nearby, I did compaction testing on Evelynburg, did concrete slumping on the Hampton Inn, and actually we had set up a seismograph on the old Kmart building when they were doing dynamic compaction for the Hampton Inn to make sure it didn't cause any cracks in the foundation of the building with the Kmart. So worked on several projects in the area. As I mentioned to Keith, I reside in Shenandoah County. I also have a farm in Pendleton County, West Virginia, so I'm back and forth through the area fairly frequently. We have 20 slides. I'm not going to read everything that's on those. We don't have any leave behind, but we can certainly provide the PowerPoint presentation as a PDF for anyone that would want it. We can just provide that and you can look back through it. So again, go through some of the terminology and talk about some example sites, and as Cindy mentioned, feel free to ask questions throughout. I'm going to talk about what we ordinarily do for banks that is associated with either a property acquisition or refinancing. So we follow specific standards. But we can certainly do whatever may be needed to facilitate a property transaction. That can be, we have the tank, can you come out and do a hand auger around the tank to see if it's leaks? So we can modify the scope of work depending on what the needs are. So I'll start off with this example, and I have a little bit more information for this. As you can see, there were these pipes in the pavement, and this is actually a site in Martinsburg, West Virginia that I'm working on. And we ended up doing some additional work, and we ended up finding 2 gasoline tanks. And I did steal the laser from the cat at home, so hopefully he won't be too angry when I get back. So we can use that to go along. So there are many forms of due diligence when it comes to purchasing a property. It can be traffic studies, it can be utilities, it can be the zoning, it can be drainage, all sorts of things. So we're going to talk about environmental due diligence. And basically, you're looking at what are the environmental conditions based on the current use, past use with the property, and are there financial legal risks to a prospective purchaser or the bank that's lending the money. So as I mentioned, most of the work that we get in this field is from the bank, from the prospective purchaser, could be through a real estate attorney, or could be through a commercial realtor or residential realtor as well. Again, some reasons why you perform an environmental assessment: liability protection, fines, delays. Delays are a big thing. You find a problem, and then the bank may require something to be done. The prospective purchaser may want it assessed, remediated. Again, there's basically 2 guidance documents. It's the EPA's All Appropriate Inquiry Rule, and then there's the ASTM standard. I added this in the red because they didn't have room anywhere else on the slides. But one thing that pops up, we'll get requests. You all prepared an ESA report, we believe it was like 2010. Can we get a copy of that? The owner doesn't have it, etc. And that's fine, and it's useful information. But there is a shelf life to these reports. So again, it can provide some useful information. It gives you some history on the site. But ordinarily, for the liability protection in most lenders, it has a 6-month shelf life. It can be updated within a 6 to 12-month period, so you can do certain parts of it over. But once you're past that, you're looking at doing a new assessment and preparing a new report. And so we will get calls, for example, we need you to do an update. Well, once it's that old, you're going through the same steps. It's basically a new report. You're going to attach the old report as an appendix. You're going to look at maybe some things there. For example, if it has historical aerial photographs, you might be able to use that. You can use the geology section, but ordinarily you're going through all the steps again. I also bring up, and Cindy had mentioned that before, we'll also get requests. We have an ESA report, can you take a look at it? And we can do that. Again, if you have a question, you'll have our contact information. Reach out to us, and we'll see if we can help you. And that's the most important thing I want you all to take away from this is we're here to help however we can, in what way we can. So give us a call, shoot us an email, and we'll do what we can. So there's basically 2 primary assessment processes when evaluating a property. One is a transaction screen, and the other is a phase 1 environmental site assessment. transaction screen quicker, cheaper, but of course it doesn't go into the depth that an ESA does. And these are ordinarily used for rural properties, undeveloped properties. There's a low risk. There aren't industries, commercial uses in the vicinity. Phase 1 is what we most commonly do. It's what's normally required. You all, for example, may get involved with banks that they'll do what they call a desktop search. They'll use a third-party regulatory database search, EDR. So some bankers will do an online search of regulatory agency files and make a determination on that whether they need to go and do more investigation. So the terminology when you get to conclusions is a recognized environmental condition, and so that's a problem where you do further investigation in a phase 2. Phase 2 is basically sampling and testing. We will do sampling and testing in a phase 1 if we know we're probably going to make a recommendation to do one anyway. So to save time, to save money, if there is a underground storage tank, it's been there for 50 years, more than likely we're going to make the recommendation to collect the sample and test it. So if we know that up front, that's one of the things we ask. Is there any documentation available? Do you know of any problems? We'll roll that into phase 1 again to try to save time. Historical wreck is basically, it's a leaking tank that the DEQ closed 10 years ago because they didn't feel it was a risk to human health and environment. So that's an historical wreck. A controlled wreck is where there's a land use covenant. There is an institutional control, there's an engineering control. The property can't be used for residential use. Groundwater can't be used. There's asphalt covering some impacted soil. So that's controlled through a land use covenant, engineering control. And then de minimis is just a minor issue. There's a surface spill from a drum, but it seems to be minor as far as the extent. We wouldn't consider that a wreck. We might make the recommendation, of course, to clean it up, but we wouldn't consider that a wreck. What I have on the right is a reliance letter that SBA requires when there's an SBA loan. And it's a template that we're not allowed to change, just basically fill in the necessary information. And I have that in there as a talking point related to when we prepare a phase 1 environmental site assessment, we're preparing it for someone to use for liability protection. So one of the things that we ask when we're preparing a proposal or contract, who's going to rely on this report? We like to have the contract with that party, with that person, and that the report be addressed to them. Now, we get asked to prepare third-party reliance letters later on, maybe the bank or something like that. But our preference is to have the contract with the party that's going to rely on it, so we can address the report, that we don't have to go back and make modifications to whom the report is presented and issued to. So we can do third-party reliance letters, and we can provide SBA reliance letters as well. Talking about a phase 2, again, that's sampling and testing. It's when the transaction screen, phase 1 identifies a wreck. It's a high risk. There's some sort of data gap. For example, yes, the underground storage tank was removed 10 years ago, but no one can find the closure report. No one can find the soil samples. There's no documentation that we can rely on to say that there wasn't a problem. So that's a data gap. Phase 2 can be subsurface exploration, same thing, testing with the geoprobe. Could be geophysical study, GPR, soil, surface water, groundwater sampling, vapor intrusion study, where we'll drill through the slab and actually collect soil vapor samples to analyze, and then hazardous material surveys looking for PCBs, mercury, those sorts of things, and switches and thermostats. Now, this is a site that was on the first slide. Maps. There's something that are available through third-party regulatory database that also can be available at your local library. But this is a law office, and this is a hair salon. So when we checked the city directories, it said there was a taxi service. Well, then when we pull up the Sanborn fire insurance map, it says filling station. Okay. So Sanborn fire insurance maps were created around the turn of the 19th century, and they were used to develop rates to insure property against fire. So they have very meticulous maps, but ordinarily they're limited to the core area of the city. So they're not going to be out, for example, here on 33. Downtown is where you're going to have them. But they're very meticulous. They have a lot of notes. They talk about what the building is constructed of, what it was used for, and they list gas tanks and type of uses. So we have that, and if you recall from the first slide, when you walk around to the back of the building, you see these two pipes sticking out of the pavement. So we did ground penetrating radar on the front, because ordinarily the tanks are in front of the building next to the street. There wasn't anything there, but of course when we got back there, we had these anomalies, and then once we uncovered them, there are two gasoline tanks. This is particular to West Virginia, but in Virginia with the DEQ, when you have leaking tanks in town, and there isn't what's considered a risk to human health and environment, basically, nobody's on groundwater. There's no vapors in the basement. There's no oil in the sump. There's no stream next door. The DEQ will just close the case, even if there's contamination present. It's not that way in West Virginia. It's very complicated because of the Groundwater Protection Act, which you have to go through and you have to assess and you have to risk it away. More complicated. Now the DEQ, they have a zero tolerance for contamination in groundwater that's used for drinking water purposes. And I'll get to that here shortly. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to. I'll ask one question, which I meant to ask at the beginning. How many of you all have read a Phase 1 ESA report, have recommended to a client to get a Phase 1 environmental site assessment done? Okay. So one of the most common things we run into are tanks because they were everywhere. And you can have industrial, commercial, agricultural property. So you're looking at what was the historical use of the property. Again, that was a taxi service or a taxi stand instead of a hair salon than it is now. And you're also looking at how was the building heated. What I normally see in downtown areas is you have this progression from, you'll see the coal chutes, then you have the heating oil tanks, and now it's natural gas. But just keep in mind, maybe natural gas now, but what was it 50 years ago? So your suspect sites for tanks or filling stations, automobile dealerships, dry cleaners. Dry cleaners can be very complicated because the perk that they use are sinkers, so instead of it floating on the groundwater, it sinks. So it's difficult to remediate, and it becomes ubiquitous in the area if you do have release. So when you have dry cleaners, especially in these strip malls, you want to know, is it a drop-off location or do they actually do dry cleaning there? And if they've done dry cleaning there for many years, more than likely there's a problem. I'll mention one thing about filling stations. I run into this a lot The gas tanks and the diesel tanks out front have been removed, and there's good documentation. The used oil tank on the side of the building is still there. It wasn't pulled. The heating oil tank in the back of the building is still there. So a lot of your older stations, they didn't have public water and sewer. And that's another thing you need to keep in mind. You have public water and sewer that's been extended recently. But 30 years ago, they could have had a well, they could have had a septic, they could have floor drains in their service bay, the floor drains could have went out, discharged into the septic, they could have went out into a dry well. So keep that in mind. Also, you'll run in the hydraulic lifts, a lot of the old ones, of course, with the pistons, the cylinders, go beneath the slab, and they'll have those small reservoir tanks which are beneath the slab as well, so they can leak. Horse farms, residential properties can have tanks too. Tanks are normally next to the barn, equipment shed, and of course the heating will next to the dwelling, multiple tanks. My experience, most farmers don't pull out the leaking tank, they just put a new one in. Usually you'll see a pump, maybe the fill port or the vent lines. And again, keep in mind, even though there's a propane tank there now, how was it heated before? So, when you go on 81 North and you get on 66 to head to DC, at the front row exit, there's a Target on the north side. Okay, this was the house that used to sit where the Target is. So, see this vent pipe right here? That's the vent pipe to this tank. So you look, okay, you ask the owner, how's the house heated? Well, it's heated with an above ground tank. Well, it's heated with an above ground tank because the underground tank started to leak. So just keep that in mind. One of the great things Virginia has is the Virginia Petroleum Storage Tank Fund. The other states do not have. West Virginia used to have an insurance fund, but it's spent. So this is a great thing to cover the significant costs that can be incurred related to a leaking tank. Now, it can only be used for a leaking tank. If there isn't any evidence of a release, the state isn't going to reimburse just pulling a tank. But they will potentially, if you follow their direction and you follow the process, that they will reimburse for investigations and cleanup of releases. Some things that they will not cover is negligence, one being the case where an HVAC repairman had a problem with the furnace, the tank had water in it, so he decided to pump the contents out of the tank out in the yard. The homeowner was not happy, and the DEQ says, no, we're not going to cover that. So they don't cover building permit to pull the tank disposal, repair, replacement, and the release has to be reported within 24 hours for underground and immediately for above ground. And then they have forms where you have to list what you're going to do, how many borings, how many wells, how much soil you're going to remove, and that has to be pre-approved by the case manager. But it works, and it worked for me. The house I was living in had a heating oil tank. I could always tell when I had heating oil delivered because I could smell it as soon as I got out of the car. And the problem was, when the tank was installed, the fill pipe was against the foundation of the house so that they wouldn't have to mow around it. So the fill pipe went down, it elbowed, went out to where the tank was, and it elbowed again. So when the delivery guy, he couldn't stick the tank to know how much fuel he needed to add. What he needed to do was to stand there with the nozzle at the tank to know when to stop. But they don't always do that, or this person didn't always do it. So there was overfill. So I did a handover beside the tank, knowing that we were going to sell it and that this might be a concern, did a hand auger, there was contamination. My neighbor, she was still on a drinking water well, even though there was public water in the vicinity, and there was contamination there, although I argued with the DEQ it was from the gas station across the street because it was MTBE. But regardless, we ended up, a home heating oil tank and a farm tank is $500. Now for commercial tanks, it depends on the volume of product that they pump through at all of their stations in the Commonwealth, so it can range from 5,000 to 50,000, but most large companies have discovered that it's better for them to list each individual gas station as an LLC. So that way their deductible is 5,000 at each site instead of 50,000. So these are two sites that we've worked on where the costs are upward of $1 million. So this site is on Route 7 east of Berryville in Clark County, and it was gasoline with ethanol, and we actually had to construct bioreactors to use microbes to treat the ethanol because our treatment system, which is right here, would not remove the ethanol. So we had a treatment system that pulled out that pumped groundwater, separated free product, had an air stripper to volatilize the VOCs, and then we had to treat the ethanol with these bioreactors. And we ended up drilling, this was in limestone, so we ended up drilling a new well 800 feet deep with 400 feet of casing for the community, and we're still monitoring that site. This site is off Port Republic Road, and I don't know if any of you may have noticed that driving along, but the old Hojo's is here, and that's the JMU parking lot. So that release was discovered in late 2015, and we just closed the site this year. So that was a situation where we had a treatment system in there to pump and treat, and because of the fund, most of the money spent there were reimbursed through. Two other sites that I worked on in years past was Shoals Plumbing near Dayton, and then Johnny's Exxon near McGackeville, and they were six-figure cleanup sites as well.
How is the fund funded?
You're paying a tax at the pump. But I would emphasize again, in years past, the DEQ was more liberal in cleaning up sites. They would more or less approve cleanup of impacted soil around the tank, even if there wasn't a risk, even if it was an area of public water. They've certainly gotten more conservative, and a lot of times it's pump the tank out, get the tank out, but we're not going to reimburse for over excavation of any contamination. So it's all based on risk to them. Is it a commercial site? Is there public water available? Is the area paved? Is there a basement? We don't consider that a risk. If it's a residential neighborhood where everybody's on drinking water wells and there's something in the groundwater, that's a high priority to them. So they will, if you're unable to remediate the site and the problem lingers, you'll have to come up with an alternative water system, and that's usually drilling a new well. If it's an individual site, if there's clustered houses, it may be extending public water. We have a site in Berryville right now where, depending on whether the problem continues and spreads, that public water may have to extend up the street.
It's a disclosure issue though for us, because once you disclose it, no one will buy it.
I can understand that being concerned, and we run into that with, as you can imagine, a lot of times this problem is discovered when somebody's looking to buy the house, and maybe they test the well. And I'm off on a tangent again, but a lot of times people say, well, the well was tested. You say, well, how was it tested? Well, the health department. They say, well, you have to explain, well, it was for coliform bacteria, it wasn't for control. So sometimes people are aware of that and they will test for other things. They'll, or like I said, they'll ask us to come out and do a handoff on the side of the tank. Keep in mind that once a release is discovered and reported to the state, that prior property owner is considered the responsible person, the RP. So the new owner, unless they do something that they shouldn't do, is not going to be held responsible of DEQ. If the problem reoccurs, the DEQ is going to go back to that RP, and again, you're still working it through the fund. And then the DEQ also has what they call a state lead fund, where if the prior owner is deceased or the state no longer exists, the state has a fund where they will go in and remediate the site through that fund. But it is important to know that if there is a problem and it's reported to the DEQ prior to the ownership change, the DEQ will consider the prior owner the responsible person. And that you're in most banks, once you get that case closure letter from the DEQ, that ordinarily suffices for them as far as the lending. Like I said, depending on the bank, depending on the loan officer. Another common thing, especially here in the Shenandoah Valley, fruit orchards. Early 1900s, you had the lead arsenate. So if you test the soil, and of course lead and arsenic are naturally occurring, so it's going to be there anyway. It's certainly going to be a lot higher in Colorado than it's going to be here because of volcanic rock. But, so if you sample and test it, you'll find it. And then if lead arsenate was used, you're going to have elevated levels of arsenic. That's the driver on most all the sites that I get involved with that orchard, it's elevated levels of arsenic. And then of course, around World War II, they phased out the lead arsenate and they started using the chlorinated pesticides, the DDT. So, most of the work that I do with orchards is in West Virginia because the West Virginia DEP, that's a priority for them. And they strongly urge developers to enter their properties into the voluntary remediation program if they're going to change the use. As long as they stay in agricultural use, it's not a concern. It's when you switch use and it becomes residential use, and of course you have children and people living there, that becomes a human health concern. Ordinarily, regulatory agencies assume that the farmer applied the chemical per the directions on the bag. So it's not a regulated issue, except at mixing stations where things could have been spilled or dumped, and then it becomes a record hazardous waste issue. So in Virginia, in my experience, most of the orchards are developed, DEQ doesn't get involved, the local agencies don't get involved. It's a business risk, and the developer has to decide what the risk tolerance is and whether they take it into the program or not. Again, well, Virginia also has a voluntary remediation program. One site many years ago, we sampled and tested, and there was concern about the levels, even though, for example, West Virginia has a background level of 13. At this particular site, I think the levels are 7, 9, and 11. Virginia doesn't have a background level, so you have to establish one or use their risk assessment guidance. But anyway, it was decided, the DEQ, and this was Virginia DEQ, VRP people, they went and did this. They decided to go to the adjoining park and collect samples, and historically it was never used as an orchard. They went in, sample and tested for arsenic, and the arsenic levels in the park were higher than on this farm that had the orchards. And so the issue kind of went away, although I'm not sure that they really announced that to the area, that what the levels were in the park. So for your use, aerial photographs, historical aerial photographs, In the old days, we used to go to the Soil Conservation Service and we would look at those, and they would still have those. Now, most of that's online, but that's certainly useful, and it's at your fingertips to check that out. I'll talk about asbestos here. We'll get to phase 1 ESAs. It's not covered, it's not included. You're looking for petroleum products and hazardous materials waste. So asbestos isn't in there. But of course, asbestos can be present and there can be a cost associated with abating it if the building is going to be demoed or the building is going to be renovated. So some materials were banned, but not all. You can have imported material. You can have contractors that use material in their warehouse just to finish out an addition because it's there. I've performed inspections on buildings that were certified by the architect and the GC that didn't contain asbestos, and I found asbestos. So NESHAP is one of the rules that we follow, and it's a notification requirement, and ordinarily it only applies to institutional, commercial, and industrial building. However, if it's a residential property and it's going to be redeveloped for maybe commercial use, then they would regulate it. I mentioned here that asbestos is defined as greater than 1%, but of course OSHA, they're going to regulate it if it's there. So this happens all the time. We'll do an asbestos inspection and the lab will come back and say there's trace asbestos or there's less than 1%. OSHA still considers that a regulated activity. So you end up, in most of the time, removing it, even though it's not defined by EPA as asbestos. OSHA regulates that, and you'd have to have, again, a work-safe environment. So in those situations, we would recommend removal. And this actually happened on Erickson Avenue Extension. I did asbestos inspections for the city, and we had a house there that it was less than 1%, but because of the OSHA regulation, we ended up removing it before the home was demolished. So with asbestos, you get a demo permit. It asks about asbestos, and again, with the state under NESHAP, there's a form where you have to notify. Even if there isn't any asbestos present, you're supposed to notify the state whenever you demo a building, even if there isn't any asbestos there. And there is a notification time frame as far as the number of days, and then there's a fee depending on the quantity. So I just throw that in there because asbestos is commonly present. It's not part of an ESA. Sometimes we'll do that as a separate task item when we're asked to inspect a property because, again, it can also be leverage. The prospective purchaser wants to know, but it's also, okay, if there's asbestos there and it's $50,000 to abate it, well, that may come into the negotiating part of the transaction. Types of asbestos: friable. This is the bad stuff. This is the sprayed on fireproofing. It's the usually around your heating, HVAC systems, the corrugated cardboard around piping. Again, mostly boiler systems relating to heating oil systems. And so this is the stuff that can become airborne and can be a health hazard. Your non-friable is using your roofing and your flooring. How many of you have seen siding on a house that has a scallop bottom to it? I mean, that is asbestos. That's transite. 9-inch almost always is asbestos. Some 12-inch can be. And your mastic, you get that black mastic, it almost always is too. Now, again, I get calls on this. I think I've got 9-inch floor tile. I think I've got linoleum that might be asbestos. And my response is in good shape. Yes, in good shape. You're fine. You can floor over it. most homeowners create a bigger problem going in and trying to tear it out. They don't understand or use their vacuum, not realizing they need a HEPA filter, so they just make matters worse. And the thing is, if it's in good shape, leave it alone. It's fine. But that could be a concern to a prospective purchaser, whether there's asbestos there and what the condition is. Same way with, yes, sir.
How's joint compound liable?
Well, there are lots of discussions about whether it would be or not, because it would be difficult under hand pressure. But ordinarily, the regulatory agencies will consider it friable, because once you try to remove it, it's going to become friable, even though you wouldn't be able to walk up here and do it again. It's going to be
So
considered.
with wallboard, when did they stop allowing, how old the house does it have to be that has wallboard that could be?
I can't give you a date, because you can get imported material.
Even today? Yeah.
I've actually done inspections in buildings. You'll find it on one floor, but not on the other floor. And did they open up a different bucket of mud? I guess. But it won't even be consistent. And of course, the age of your structure, whether you have additions and renovations, that plays a part. But no, I couldn't give you a date to say for certain that the joint compound would not have. I mean, a lot of people will say, well, it's after 1980, we don't need to worry about it, but you can't say that for certain. Yes, sir.
What's a quick way to tell if the tile is asbestos?
Well, the only way to tell without sending to a lab to look under a microscope is it 9 or 12 inch? If it's 9 inch, it probably is. 12 inch, it may not be. But there's
Little
the
tile,
only
big
way.
tile.
The
Little
only
tile,
way.
big tile, yeah.
Yeah, the only way to, and we send samples off to the lab. That's the only way you can say for certain. The way the regulations are, you can assume it's asbestos containing, but you can't assume it isn't. So the only way that you can prove that it isn't is send it to laboratory. Now, there's certain things that we see, like this transite siding, 9-inch floor tile, the corrugated pipe insulation and boilers, the mudded joints. We're going to assume that is. We can certainly test it, but those things are ordinarily going to come back positive.
You mentioned that if it's looks like it's in good shape, just leave it alone.
That's my recommendation, yes, to a homeowner.
What if there are just a few cracked pieces of tile?
Well, again, with the tile, with it being friable or non-friable, the matrix is bound up, so you're not ordinarily going to have it released into the air. So again, it's just the condition. You know, do you have one tile that's just broken through the middle, or do you have one tile that the edges are starting to break and there's little pieces all over, and then there's a lot of foot traffic on that? It depends on how severe the problem is and how widespread it is.
So if you cover it, like you have an old asbestos floor tile, and it's ugly anyhow, and you're buying, you can cover it. And that
Sure, you're creating a barrier, no different than if these older homes have lead-based paint. I mean, you're creating a barrier whether you drywall over top of it, paneling, you're painting over it. I mean, with paint, you're worried about friction sources. Your doors, your windows, where you have constant rubbing, and although you may paint over it, once you have that friction, then it gets to the paint. So it's about exposure. Are you going to breathe it? Are you going to ingest it? And of course, with paint, it's children, the hand to mouth, the smaller kids. You have paint chips on the floor, you have dust on the floor. So just because it's there doesn't mean it has to be removed. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's a risk. It's is there exposure pathway? Can someone ingest it or breathe it? And so yeah, you can certainly floor over. And I'm sure you're aware, you'll go into one of these old houses do an asbestos inspection, and you walk from the dining room to the kitchen. Well, the kitchen floor is like 2 inches higher than the rest. Well, another layer, another luan, and then another layer of vinyl flooring. And when you do your inspection, once you get down, you know, the flooring 5 layers down is probably 9-inch floor tile. some of the other things that we do, which may be of interest, is Alta and house location surveys. We can do construction monitoring. I mean, so we have surveying, we have geotechnical engineering, construction monitoring and inspections. So we have other services, which of course ordinarily may be more related to the actual development of the property. So any other questions?
How much does a typical elevation study cost?
I would have to ask our surveyor on that one. I don't know that off the top of my head. Sure.
I came across something this last week about generator amendment, basically, where it's saying if the generator, say a bunch of oil drums, just says, hey, it's used oil, or it's used oil in antifreeze, that gives, in this case, me, I'm the buyer actually, gives me free, like innocent land ownership basically. How much do you come across that or tell people to do that? That's what the engineer told me to do, is make sure to get this amendment
It's all
signed.
about documentation. So, you know, cradle to grave sort of thing. Funny you should mention that. Up at Woodstock, and I guess I can say this until we sold the building, but Bobby Grubb, where the Chevy dealership was in Woodstock, he had a body shop up the road, and he leased it to a gentleman, and he ended up selling the property, and I went in and did an inspection of the property before the individual vacated the business. I got a call from EPA for an investigator who came into the office, and they found these drums out in the National Forest, and instead of removing it and disposing it, just dumped it. They came in, they looked at my report, they looked at the photographs, and I was able to document to them that these drums were present in that business while this individual leased it, and so they went after that individual. So it's all about paperwork. You know, who owns it, who generated it, how did they dispose of it, a disposal manifest. It's always about paperwork that you can prove it's someone else's and it's not yours. Again, I just emphasize, if you run across a situation, don't hesitate to call or email. We can tailor the scope of work to as little as much as you may need. We understand you're trying to get the deal to go through, and if there's something that we can do to facilitate that or to help to protect your client, then that's what we want to do.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you all so much for your time. I think we said at the beginning, but just in case for people that came in late, I'll be sure to email the slides, and then they can be available to you guys. There was a lot of information there, so that might be a good reference point for you. Emails in the slide, there's cards up here also to grab, so that you just have our contact information should you ever need anything or have any questions. But thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That's so close to you.
I know.
Thanks for coming. A lot of their all we're going to close the
She decided Steve's not doing well.
And then all of next year,
Started having
so I
like
have like about
and
my husband is like starting a home.
She was not home.
And we were lucky enough to keep it as a rental
So I made
property.
a great
Yeah.
Are now we went out to the park with my dogs on a Sunday day, and it was nice weather.
So that's what you're
It's pretty cool, like,
I would love to more. Yeah. So she had such a great vision for it. They got this
so you're hoping to
make it a resident home floor.
They delaminated, I mean, they
Make an office
Yeah.
apartment. You could
being
make it
west
a
of
two-story house.